thank you all for joining us again for another USCAL Global Table. I'm Vince Thomas, and we are just getting ready to have a dynamic dialogue. One thing that I want to let everyone know, if you've been around for a while, you know I'm going to ask you on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube to just let us know where you're tuning in from. It just gives us an idea of just how far this conversation is being held. And also, I wanted to avail your attention to the USCAL.us website, where we host different content that we've discussed, all of our global tables, as well as the virtual bridge summit. If you weren't a part of that, you definitely want to be a part of that. It's on the USCAL.us website, along with a host of other resources. So grateful that you all have joined us today, and looking forward to the dynamic discussion. So Bishop Joe, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Okay, as already mentioned in the last table, there is a October 10th video roundtable. We try to do at least 2 to 4 a year from USCAL. And this year, it's going to be the esteemed New Testament scholar, Craig Keener. He's the author of perhaps the greatest commentary on the book of Acts in the history of the church. The background, cultural background Bible, which is amazing, and so many books. I mean, he just sent me about 5 or 6 books from Baker, and he's sending me a whole bunch more. You know, we become friends through the prophetic standard statement, which he signed on to. So we became friends through that. Yeah, amazing. So October 10th, 7:30 p.m., put it in your calendar, next USCAL, semi-minor mini conference, so to speak. Okay, so today we have an amazing discussion that you're going to be in for a treat. My friend Michael Barron, who put together just an amazing tool for your library. I would suggest all of you get this book that he's going to show you in a minute. As preachers and communicators of the Word of God, whether in the church place or marketplace, it's vital that you understand the greatest book ever given to humankind, and that's the Bible. And there are various translations. Some are terrible, some are, okay, and some are very good. Some are great for reading narrative. Some are great for word serious study. And today we're going to focus on 2 of the most controversial right now. And if we have time, we'll get into some other things. But Matthew, give us a quick snapshot, like a 1-minute snapshot of your biblical journey.
Okay. Oh boy, my biblical journey starts when I was young. I think I was about 6 years old, and I started pulling out a Bible and trying to transcribe it word for word with as many English letters as I knew at the time. But I didn't get very far. But right there, I had the makings of a scribe. And you remember what Jesus said about scribes who enter the kingdom of heaven are like those who pull out of the treasure stores things both old and new. And that's one of the joys of going through Bible translations. It really is like pulling out treasures both old and new. I love the old translations, like Tyndale's and King James Version. But I value so highly having the Bible in a language that people can understand, and I love different renderings of it that add, and I wouldn't say necessarily more flavor, but it's almost like taking a diamond and turning it around so the different facets finally show and gleam. Like, oh, now I'm starting to get the whole picture.
Yeah, this book was a compilation of a lot of interaction with many theologians, scholars. It's a shame you didn't get credit for it at a master's or a PhD level, but can you hold up the book? I highly recommend this book. I've read most of it. Can you tell us the thesis of this book? Why did you write it, and what is the content?
Sure. The book's titled The Best Bible, ? because that's the question people ask me as I was going along. About 6 years ago, I was at a small group with a friend of mine who said, "Man, Matt, I got people asking me what the best Bible is. What do you recommend?" I was like, well, I have some thoughts off the top of my head, but those are just presuppositions and prejudices. So I'll tell you what, I'll write a reference work. And it was supposed to be much thinner, and it ended up being a lot thicker. This is about a 600-page book that of my journey discovering Bible translations. And the summary of it is it takes you into three sections. The first section gives you the kind of the overview of the translation process and the production process of a translation. The middle section is a short, brief review of where we got our English Bible translations, starting from John Wycliffe back in the 1300s, late 1300s, to the King James Version of the 1611. And then the last section is a detailed assessment and review of 12 of the most popular translations today. And I found in my discoveries, I found that there's about 40 or so English Bible translations currently in print, and only a handful of them are really bad ones. The majority of them tend to be very good. But it's just that they're designed for specific audiences or specific applications.
Okay, so let's just jump right into this. There is, a popular translation amongst charismatics today. A lot of charismatics are referencing it. No squabble with someone wanting to write a translation on their own. And I'm sure the intent is good. I'm sure they're great people, and they may be even value in reading the translation in certain ways. But what is your honest scholarly opinion of the Passion Bible or Passion Translation of the Bible? What are the strengths, weaknesses? What is its use?
So the Passion Translation, produced by Brian Simmons, Brother Brian, his intent was to get the heart of God, to transfer the heart of God into modern English readers. He wanted to carry the passion of the Scripture into the hearts of believers. That was his intent. And well, I don't think he quite reached that goal. And again, not that I have a problem with a single translator translation, not that I have a problem with, this is he doesn't really have a committee or anything like that. That's not a problem. What is the problem is there are certain biases that creep in, and without reviewers to address them, they tend to perpetuate throughout the translation. So the biases are one thing that I really find objectionable with the Passion Translation, and it's mostly seen, you can really see it clearly actually in his rendering of the Song of Solomon. He takes an interpretation that the Song of Solomon is an allegorical book describing the relationship between God and his church. And he takes that interpretation and imposes that on the rendering. So if there were any other possible interpretation, let's say like it was I view it as, sure, it can be an allegory, but I view it as also an erotic love poem between a lover and his beloved. And Brian Simmons will not allow that kind of rendering to creep through because he has a bias against the nature of that reading. And so it's not just my opinion about the text, but also people who are experienced in Bible translation with other translations. I think we mentioned Craig Keener. Let's see, let's see if he's here describing it. There we go. No, not Craig Keener, but he would have opinions on it, that's for sure. But you have other translators like Tremper Longman, Douglas Moo, Craig Blomberg, Daryl Bach. They all reject the Passion Translation precisely because not just the biases, but also his assumptions about language and how language works. One goes so far as to say, despite some of the wonderful passion and turns of phrase, there's also enough problems with it that it probably should have had a Surgeon General's warning on it about its potential hazards. That's Craig Blomberg.
Oh,
One of the assumptions about the language that Brian Simmons carries into his Passion Translation is that the New Testament has a strong Aramaic basis, and it's so much so that the Aramaic renderings of the New Testament carry on more meaning than are available in the Greek Bibles, the Greek New Testament. And it's unfortunately the assumption is misinformed because it's the only Aramaic renderings we have are not really Aramaic. They're a later cognate language called Syriac. And that Syriac versions of the New Testament are themselves based on the Greek New Testament. So he's trying to bring out the passion of the New Testament through a later version that's dependent upon the Greek New Testament, which is the basis of all of our New Testaments. And it's reading back into the text things that may not necessarily, or actually are not there to begin with.
So is there any connection with the Lambda Bible, the one that people use with they believe that it's almost like a cult. They believe that is the true translation based on the Aramaic. Is there any connection with the Lambda Bible?
How to say this? Simmons is quick to denounce Lambda and denounce the Lambda movement. He doesn't accept that view himself. But even then, he depends on Aramaic translations by those who are unqualified as translators. I'm trying to recall some of their names, but they're all self-published translators of Syriac. He avers that the New Testament is translated from the Greek New Testament, but what he puts into the text are insights that he's gathered from Syriac. And he doesn't just leave them in the footnotes. He actually inserts them and puts them into the main text. One example is where Jesus is at the cross, and Brian Simmons brings this point up quite often. Jesus is on the cross, and he says, "It is finished." That's what we're familiar with our other English translations. Brian Simmons back translates the Greek word "it is finished," takes it into Hebrew, and goes through his Strong's dictionary, finding a possible association with the word bride. And so he's saying, which he puts into the text, it's like, here it is. It's not "it is finished," it's "my bride." So Jesus is making the point, supposedly at the cross, that it's referring to why he was on the cross, but not necessarily that it doesn't carry the text, the meaning of the text across, meaning the original Greek.
All right. Well, let's move on from the Passion. Let me just ask one question. From your opinion, and this is the last question about the Passion, is there any, in your opinion, would there be any profit in reading the Passion for serious study, or is it just good for, what would you, is there any profit in the Passion?
So I would never recommend it for serious study. It has some great devotional comments. The biggest problem is there are inaccuracies. I found inaccuracies within even his footnotes. So it becomes a challenge. You'd have to be a professional to know which of his footnotes are worthy of application and which are to be discarded. And so it's a rather hit and miss. That's why I could never even recommend the Passion Translation, not even for its footnotes.
All right, moving on. I remember getting taught and reading books that we were supposed to go by the majority text. The King James Version came from the Antiochian tradition, which is the most accurate, oldest. The modern translations have come from the Alexandrian tradition, which was a corrupt tradition. And there's some attempts at scholarship to downplay the veracity of the modern translations from the quote unquote King James only movement. So first, what give us a snapshot of what you think of the King James Version. And people don't understand that it's a translation from another translation, the Bishop's Bible, and then the Geneva Bible, of course. Give us a snapshot of the King James Version and what you think of the King James only controversy. What is your position on that?
So the King James Version was kind of the ideal translation at its time. It was produced by a strong committee of people who were able linguists in their day. And as Brother Mattera said, the King James Version was really a revision of the Bishop's Bible of a few years, 40 years earlier, which itself was based largely on the influence of the Geneva Bible, which I personally believe the Geneva Bible is probably even better than the King James Version. The King James Version was produced for the Anglican Church by Anglicans, mostly Reformed. They all held to the Anglican creeds. And one of the reasons why the King James Version only movement exists is because the King James Version was produced just before the great Reformed creeds, like the Westminster Confession of Faith, which itself makes references to passages that are found only in the King James Version. And so there's a huge movement to defend the King James Version because of its support because of its apparent support within the Westminster Confession of Faith, which, by the way, I love the Westminster Confession of Faith. I think it's a good creed, but I don't think that's an adequate justification for the King James Version only. But the King James Version, it's kind of its history. We have to go back to 1516 with the publication of a little Greek New Testament, a diglot, a two-language edition of the Greek New Testament. Actually, it goes back even further. So let me backtrack even there. 60 years before, you have two major influential events. One in Germany, in Mainz, Germany, you have a little guy by the name of Johannes Gutenberg, of the Gutenberg Bible fame. He invented or perfected the movable type system. That created a process for producing Bibles much more cheaply and at greater distribution. At the same decade, in 1452, you have a little city, actually not a little city, a very big city, to the east called Constantinople, the former Roman capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And in 1452, the Ottoman Turks overran its walls. This is significant because the Greek community, the Greek elites, and the Greek intellectuals left Constantinople, fled for their lives, and landed in places like Venice, Italy. And they brought the Greek scribes, Greek monastics, brought with them their Greek manuscripts, largely of the Byzantine style or the Byzantine family of manuscripts. And these became the basis for new printed editions. 1516, Desiderius Erasmus publishes is the first printed Greek New Testament, which that forms the basis for Martin Luther's translation of the September Testament in 1522, I believe. And then a later edition of Erasmus's Greek New Testament becomes the basis for William Tyndale's 1525, 1526 edition of the New Testament. And these Greek New Testament printed editions are based on a small number of later Byzantine manuscripts. What's significant, okay, so I need to break down a couple phrases when we talk about manuscripts. You may have heard the term majority text. Majority text is the sum democratic vote of all the readings within all the existing extant manuscripts. It just so happens that the majority of these manuscripts tend to be of the Byzantine family. The Byzantine family of manuscripts tend to be later because the later manuscripts, as they're further north in their provenance, up in the Turkey, some in the Sinai Peninsula, it's the oldest ones some of the oldest ones of the Byzantine family we have, they go back to, let's say, the 5th century. And it was only copies of that family of Greek manuscripts from the 12th to 14th century that were included in Erasmus's Greek New Testament, which forms the basis for Tyndale, Geneva, Bishops, and the King James Version. Much later on, 400 years passed between the King James Version and the American Standard Version, and you have lots of discoveries. The British Empire expands. You have adventurers and explorers and archaeologists digging in foreign parts of the realm, and you guys have guys digging in places like the Oxyrhynchus Valley in Egypt, or in that area. They are able to dig up very old, very ancient fragments and portions of the New Testament that some date as early back as the mid to late 2nd century. These are the earliest New Testament fragments that we have. And as these pieces were put together, and there was a greater need to produce a critical edition of the New Testament text, the Greek New Testament, that predated what the King James Version translators had to work with. And that became the basis for the English Revised Version, became the basis for the American Standard Version, and all the modern editions to this day were based upon earlier manuscript discoveries than the King James Version had access to. The differences between, let's say, the critical text and the Byzantine family, I should say the critical text and the majority text, the difference is maybe less than 4% of the New Testament. There are some significant passages, but Erasmus, because he was working from manuscripts and not complete ones at that, he had to actually do some back translation from the Latin Vulgate into his Greek edition. For instance, there's certain passages at the end of Revelation that he didn't have access to. So we have a unique rendering in the King James Version where it says, it talks about the book of life, when the critical editions say, no, it's not book of life. We have manuscript evidence. It says it's tree of life. So it's a difference of a difference of significance there. You have also a passage in 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 through 8, talks about the three witnesses. You have the blood, the water, and the spirit. You have Father, Son, and Spirit. And the words Father and Son and the Holy Spirit there are not in the original text. They were added kind of as the story goes, that was kind of added as a bet, where Erasmus didn't have them in his Greek manuscripts, and his associates, his Catholic associates, said, no, it's got to have this phrase. It's got to have these three witnesses in there. It's missing from your edition. It's like, okay, I'll tell you what, if you can find me a manuscript evidence in support of this reading, I'll put it in. And so they found, let's see, his edition was published in the 16th century, and they found a manuscript dated to the 16th century with those words in there in the Greek. They said, all right, you win, I'll put it in. But there's no early evidence for that reading. And that's kind of unique to the Tyndale King James tradition, thanks to Erasmus's Greek edition. By the way, Erasmus's Greek edition and the editions that are based upon it, of which there are about 11 or so editions, 12 or 11, those are collectively called the Textus Receptus. You'll see it abbreviated as TR. You may have heard that phrase, Textus Receptus.
So the King James Version only had a summary of how many manuscripts at its disposal for the translators, as opposed to, let's say, the New American Standard Version.
Oh boy, oh joy! Here, this is fun. So the King James Version translators had at their disposal about 14 Greek manuscripts in the form of a couple printed editions. 14. Compare and contrast that to our extant manuscripts. We have over 5,300 New Testament manuscripts in part or in full. Lots of them are fragments, but we have much more textual evidence for the Greek New Testament today than the King James translators ever had.
Right. And so what would you say in summary to someone who purports that the King James is the only true translation?
You'd have to recognize first off that a lot of these claims have an emotional attachment to them. And you would kind of have to point out their presuppositions. And some of those presuppositions about the King James only differ from one another. I mentioned that one of the reasons why the King James Version only movement gained strength is because the King James Version was the one that was present in 1647 when the Westminster Confession of Faith was produced. So there's an assumption that this is the one vernacular translation that God ordained because it's encapsulated or it's referred to in our Westminster Confession of Faith. And so there's that kind of that emotional theological attachment to a historic document. That's one assumption you'd have to address. Another thing is to go in, and some people have an attachment to the King James Version because it sounds holy. It sounds transcendent. Because frankly, there are words you simply cannot understand in modern English today. You actually have to have a dictionary that with historic words or obsolete words in order to understand it. And to that, you would have to take King James himself, and you go to the text that says, a trumpet, if you can't understand its call, it's no value. How's that the verse go? Here it is. I would take him to the scripture and I'd say, for indeed, if the trumpet produces an indistinct sound, who will prepare for battle? And so you through the tongue, unless you produce a clear message, how will it be known what is spoken? For you'll be speaking into the air. 1 Corinthians 14, 8-9. And that's kind of one of those basic verses that you want to take a KJV only person to say, does the King James Version itself match up with that for the scriptural mandate or scriptural standard of language use?
So what about the New King James Version? It cleans up the old language, right? Is the New King James Version good enough for serious study? It cleans up the language. It also shows the manuscript evidence. So what do you think of that version?
I very much approve of the New King James Version. I think it is a great translation. It is a static translation, which means there's no committee that's perpetuating its updates or anything like that. So it is kind of locked into the language of 1982 or 1984. But nonetheless, it is probably one of the best translations to set alongside a King James Version. And I would recommend if people are tied to the King James Version, that they would bring a new King James Version alongside so they could actually understand the words they're reading. The language is still keeps the cadences, keeps the rhythms of the King James Version. I remember I went to a Pentecostal church growing up, and it was a translation that was recommended in place of the King James Version if you wanted to memorize scripture. So I memorized a lot from the New King James Version, but objectively, I think it is it's probably the best translation to put alongside the King James Version. And it puts language in modern English. And as Brother Mattera said, it footnotes all the differences between the majority text and the critical text and the Textus Receptus. So you can see at a glance where the variations are.
One of the primary arguments against the modern translations as opposed to the King James was that the King James Version exalts the deity of Christ more than the other translations. The second argument is, well, the church used the majority text for, the first 1800 years. God smiled on that translation. That's the greatest proof. We should just use the King James Version because we didn't have access to the earlier manuscripts until the 19th century and then beginning of 20th century. So what do you say to those two arguments?
Well, here's the problem with that. is that the early church had access to earlier manuscripts. So even though the majority text was available for the last, I can't even say it's 1800 years. The Byzantine text was kind of a little bit more standardized than perhaps the other manuscript traditions, but it only kind of stems from the 4th century with Emperor Constantine, starting at around that time, and then it took off from there, came to the kind of a standard model upon which later Byzantine manuscripts were based. So different communities tended to have, like, let's say the Alexandrian Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, had a text type or a family of manuscripts with minor variations from the Byzantine family. The Byzantine tended to harmonize passages, while the Alexandrians had a community of scholars, like Origen, for example, who were more critical about the transmission of the text, and tended to be a bit more careful. From what we can gather, it tended to be a bit more careful in its transmission, so there aren't as many additions, aren't as many emendations in the Alexandrian text type. That's kind of a general paintbrush. There's, when you're talking about the discipline of textual criticism, there are innumerable number of particulars to deal with, because we have 5,300 manuscripts. We have in each manuscript is copied by hand. You try copying a letter by hand from one piece of paper to the next, you're going to have the kind of errors or kind of variants that you're looking at are typically very minor. You may see a difference in synonym. You may see a line accidentally repeated or a line accidentally omitted. You may see a transposition of words. And one of the criticisms we talk about the earlier manuscripts is that somehow it doesn't uphold the divinity of Christ so much. Well, it's not fair, because there's a tendency among Byzantine manuscripts to expand or amplify or harmonize the text. Well, when it talks about the divinity of Christ, it's usually a replacement of a synonym. I put in a link, by the way, in the comments, kgvparallelbible.org, that shows instance by instances the kinds of differences or kinds of translatable differences between critical editions and the King James text base. With 5,300 manuscripts, all hand copied as a basis of our modern translations, you're going to see variations, and the number of variants can amount some estimates, because we haven't counted them all. Some of the estimates range up to about 500,000 variants, but that's not saying much. The reason why is that the 500,000 variants, only about a single percent of them, maybe 50,000 of them, are meaningful. That is, they can be translated. In Greek New Testament, word transposition doesn't mean a whole lot in an inflected language, where words are determined by the use of a word in a sentence, determined by the word's ending. Position within a sentence is not even translatable. Spelling, if there's a difference in spelling, well, there was no standard orthography. There was no standard spelling. You didn't get, even in English, you didn't have standard spelling until Samuel Johnson made his dictionary in 1755. So those are not really a strong basis for denouncing earlier manuscripts. As far as the divinity of Christ, there are synonyms that are used. It's still referring to the same person. The referent is the same. But you can see some of those for yourself by going to that link I posted.
And there are also instances in the later manuscripts, in the later translations, where they seem to exalt the divinity of Christ better than the King James Version.
That's correct. Yeah.
I've noticed that many times. Okay, let's just jump into some of the other translations. NIV, that a good translation?
I recommend the NIV. Yeah, it was produced, it was started as an evangelistic tool. it was really intended to carry the Christian message. There's a little bit of history with the NIV going back to the late 50s. It was started by a couple of Reformed synods, in fact, who and they gathered steam and gathered a bunch more of just conservative evangelicals. All of the people who worked on the NIV, all the translators, and even the Committee of Bible Translation, signed confession of faith that they believe in Jesus Christ as the Lord. So it really is, that's the kind of the, if you care about biases, you care about assumptions, that's their working assumption. So same with the NASB, same with ESV, these guys are dedicated believers in Christ. But the NIV, what makes it such a great translation is that it is really produced for such a wide general English-speaking audience. You could take it from Bombay, India, to Brisbane, Australia. You could take it to Malaysia. You could take it to Scotland. You could take it throughout North and South US, Canada. It's understandable because it's non-colloquial English. Some people think it's a little bit more dry because of that, but it makes it a very readable translation wherever you go. And it's produced by scholars who know their work, who are definitely qualified scholars and translators. The NIV is a bit more of a word for word. It's what they call a kind of a middling translation between word for word and thought for thought.
You mean the NASB?
Oh, the NIV, no, too. The NIV tends to be, if you have an extreme word for word formal, and you have an extreme dynamic equivalent thought for thought, the NIV lands somewhere more in the middle.
Okay.
The NASB would be more word for word. The ESV would tend a little bit more word for word. The NLT, New Living Translation, would tend more towards dynamic equivalent.
And dynamic equivalent would be sentence by sentence.
Precisely.
Their main intent there is for us to understand its equivalent in English and context more than word for word formality, which many scholars prefer the word for word, but it would be wise to read the context through one of these other translations first.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the full meaning, right? Okay. Why is the NIV so much easier to read? It's really a blessing to me. I love the NIV when I'm reading something historical like the Book of Acts, the Book of Judges, First, Second Kings. Why is it so flowing? Is it better when it comes to context and narrative?
Yeah, it was specifically designed to be a general reader's Bible. And it uses, as I said, non-colloquial English, and it was translated at the sentence level, so that you're carrying the ideas. There's not a passage there that isn't justified by the language of the original, but it's still rendered in a way that fits just general English usage. That's why it flows so well.
So the intent of the NASB, according to your book, is for discipleship.
Yeah.
The intent with the NIV is more for evangelism, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the intent for the ESV? Anything in particular?
Yeah, the ESV was intended as a ministry tool for the church, because the church, as it is with its tradition, with its historic associations, the ESV, even though it comes from the Tyndale King James Version tradition, it is still a modern translation based upon critical edition. I wouldn't say critical, but eclectic editions of the Old New Testament. The ESV, what's so great about it is not only does it retain kind of the cadence and the rhythm of the KJV in modern language, but it also retains some of the more technical language in the New Testament, words like propitiation, justification, sanctification, words that have historic theological discussions surrounding them that tend to get lost in like the NIV. because the NIV is more sentence per sentence. It's trying, it doesn't want to hide significance or hide understanding. So I think for those of us who are theologically trained, we hear the word propitiation, we immediately make an association. We know that is. We know what atonement is. We know what justification is. But for someone, and that's what the ESV is so great, because it connects us to the previous generations. But for someone who's brand new to this stuff, you say the word justification, and you kind of have to explain that. And the NIV would give an interpretation of that, not necessarily a word for word. It would say made righteous in God's sight, or something like that, along those lines.
Now, I've heard some scholars say they wished their favorite translation is the NASB, which that's mine, that's for sure. But the fact that it wasn't enough of a seller, it wasn't on the bestsellers list. A lot of people are recommending the ESV, not because it's better than the NASB, but because they want more unanimity of congregational reading. They want people to try to have the same Bible in their churches. And so they're recommending the ESV, even though for personal study, they prefer the NASB. So there's a slight nuance between the NASB, the ESV, and then the later edition of the 2020 version of the NASB. So can you share the differences, the nuances between the NASB, the 2020 NASB, and the ESV?
Sure. So the NASB, kind of the descendant of the American Standard Version, which had a reputation of being the rock of biblical honesty, the NASB sought to be a very formal rendering. What I mean by formal, it allows the forms of the Greek and the Hebrew to show through to English. So when it renders grammar, it renders the grammar consistently. When it renders vocabulary, it renders it concordantly, so that the same word is repeated. It doesn't use a synonym. It tries not to use a synonym, even though it's still sensitive to the context. It tries to render English words or Hebrew and Greek words with a single English word as consistently as possible. The ESV doesn't have the same compulsion, because the King James Version itself was not that way. So it uses the same principles when it renders Greek and Hebrew. It'll allow for a synonym here and there to make it flow just a little bit better. The NASB is kind of a family of translations. Starting back in the 60s, there was an edition produced in 1977, which kind of became a standard of serious study. And then that was updated in 1995, where they improved the English usage, especially in the areas like in the Psalms and Proverbs, where they really improved the way that the English was used, so to conform to modern English usage. The update got rid of the uses of these and thous, which in prior editions was used explicitly or specifically, to refer to God in prayer. There is now a new update called the 2020. The 2020 edition, like its 1995 predecessor, retains italics to show where the translators have added words for clarity. The ESV, in the tradition of the Revised Standard Version, does not include italics. So the NASB makes it a little bit better for more careful study. The 2020 edition also, its rendering tends to be a little bit more fluid than the 95 update, especially in the prophets, particularly in Isaiah chapter 53, where they revise the language to read much more smoothly. The 2020 edition also has improved lexical vocabulary. That is, it not only updates the English, it also is more precise in the renderings, to be more precise with the ways that Hebrew and Greek were used back in the day. It's a little bit of a better linguistic tool for that purpose. There is an additional edition, the Legacy Standard Bible, which was promoted by John MacArthur, Grace to You Ministries. And the Legacy Standard Bible is another NASB Bible. The copyright's owned by Lockman Foundation, and it purports to be a very formal rendering, more formal than the 95 update. And so it becomes what I would imagine to be an ideal text for word studies, ideal for tracing themes throughout the Old and New Testaments, because it's just much more concordant and even more formal than the 2020 edition.
So it keeps some of the good updates of the 2020 version, but is a little more word for word accurate.
That's right.
Now, some may be confused with the ESV is almost, what, 90% similar to the New Revised Standard Version. And let's not get into the history of the Revised or New Revised, but it's very similar to the New Revised Standard Version, yet you claim it's very similar to the King James Version. So how could the both be true? Can you explain that?
Okay, so to clarify, the English Standard Version is much more akin to its predecessor, the Revised Standard Version, which itself was preceded by the American Standard Version, which was itself preceded by the Revised Version, which was the update to the King James Version. And because of its legacy, it retains some of the flow and the cadence and the rhythm of the King James Version. The English Standard Version's sister or cousin is the New Revised Standard Version, which was also an update of the Revised Standard Version. So the RSV kind of forms the base for the English Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version. And I put them at two different directions because that's kind of where they've gone. Where the ESV is a light revision of the Revised Standard Version. The English Standard Version, as Brother Mattera said, it's between 90 to 85 to 90% the same as the Revised Standard Version, just some slight revisions here, update language there. The New Revised Standard Version is, the NRSV is a kind of more of a radical direction from the RSV. Both the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, and the New Revised Standard Version were produced by the National Council of Churches of Christ, which is an ecumenical body, an ecumenical association of churches. But the NRSV tends to find a place in colleges. If you go to a secular college and you go to a religions class, they'd recommend you purchase the New Revised Standard Version. The NRSV was produced by people who did not make a formal commitment commitment to evangelical faith, even though there were evangelicals on the team, but it's an ecumenical Bible for everyone from Orthodox to Roman Catholic to evangelical. The NRSV is characterized by euphony. It preaches well. It was intended for liturgy, but it also tends to be a little too loose in its use of gender language. It's gender inclusive, gender inclusive to the lack of gender precision. And so, even though it's very inclusive, it allows all of its hearers to kind of for the most part, it's pretty accurate, but except for where you have the gender language.
Okay, and the ESV is similar to the King James in what way?
So it's similar to the King James in that it's not so much that its textual basis is the same. Its textual basis is different. Keeping in mind that the textual basis is only less. It's like 3.5% different from the King James Version. But it's similar because it retains some of the traditional language. I'm not talking about the these and thous, but I'm not talking about old, outdated English that nobody knows the meanings of nowadays because nobody uses that language. I'm talking about the theological terms that were starting to become specific, terms that were started to become technical even as the New Testament was being written. Words like justification, sanctification, propitiation, atonement. Words that are useful in maintaining the dialogue with historic discussions, Christian discussions. So for those who grew up with the King James Version, if they um, they would be at home with the English Standard Version. Those who grew up with the RSV would be very much at home with the English Standard Version. And I feel that the ESV has one advantage over the New King James Version. I would put those on par. But the ESV has a continuing body of translators, a group of a committee that maintains the translation and ensures that it has resources to support it. Whereas the New King James Version does not have the same amount of support. You don't find as many resources in the New King James Version as you will in the English Standard Version.
Okay, so we're going to deal with some Q&A. We got about 10 minutes left. Dino Rosado asked the question, express your thoughts on the New English translation of the Septuagint.
Oh, yeah, I've got the NETS. The New English translation of the Septuagint is a great translation produced in the last couple decades. There used to be kind of the gold standard of English translations of the Septuagint, but a little background. Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew Bible that was produced before the New Testament, before Christ came on the scene, before Jesus and his incarnation came on the scene, I should say. The Septuagint was kind of the authoritative text for the Jewish diaspora, those who were Jews who were scattered throughout the Alexander's successive kingdom states, from Egypt to Antioch. And it became kind of the Bible for the Greek-speaking church. And so you have, in the 1840s, I think it was, Lancelot Brenton produced a translation of the Septuagint as opposed to the underlying Hebrew text, so as a reference. And that became the standard. And we didn't really have modern translations of that ancient version until the New English translation of the Septuagint came along. The New English translation of the Septuagint is kind of rendered along the similar lines as the New Revised Standard Version. They complement each other really well. But it's, I think, a little bit more scholarly even though both were produced by scholars. I think the NETS is really valuable for those who want to dig into the history of the Greek Old Testament.
Okay, well, that's great. Any other questions, comments? You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself or raise your hand so we know who it is.
I see there's a question in the comments. Any thoughts on the New Living Translation? I have lots of thoughts on the New Living Translation. And they are generally good thoughts. New Living Translation is a successor of the Living Bible, but unlike the Living Bible, which was produced by a single Christian brother, Kenneth Taylor, Kenneth Taylor's son, Mark, wanted to make certain that the Living Bible had a broader audience amongst scholars and Bible professors and seminaries. So he actually approached the professors, scholars, and Bible seminarians, and he said, "Hey, we want to have a translation that kind of embodies the dynamic equivalent, sentence by sentence, thought for thought model, and we want it to become the kind of the gold standard of thought for thought dynamic equivalence translations, but we want it to be done well." So he asked a large group, I think over 100 scholars, to contribute. And the NLT was the product of this collaboration. And it is, again, it's very much a thought for thought, sentence by sentence translation, and which was why it reads so well. It reads so easily. I think it's great for devotions. I think it's great, especially for new believers who are coming in and need a Bible that won't intimidate them. It's not dumbed down language by any means, but it is language that is written for a general American audience and
Wow.
Canadians too.
So ESV would be better if we're preaching in North America, but NIV would be better if we went international to an English-speaking audience to preach? Would you say?
I think that's fair. The ESV would be good in Great Britain and the US and Canada. I don't know how well it would serve, or in Australia. I don't know how well it would serve in India, except I do know that the ESV is the only conservative evangelical translation that I'm aware of that is actually being used by Indian Catholics. There is an edition of the ESV, Catholic edition, that is being used amongst Indians today. It's what surprised me. But the NIV would be ideal for even where the ESV would have technical theological language. The NIV would be ideal for even a broader audience, those who have less familiarity with the Bible already, less familiarity with Christian theology.
Two other questions. Any thoughts on the source, New Testament?
No, I've never looked into the source. I don't have an opinion on that one at this time, although I probably will after this discussion.
What about what translation is good for, the apostolic prophetic churches? Does it make a difference in your opinion?
Apostolic prophetic churches. Well, because the apostolic prophetic has a lot of Pentecostal history, and a lot of Pentecostal churches rely a lot on the King James Version, I would say the New King James Version would be a very useful asset in that regard. If you're an apostle or a prophet, I would highly recommend a New American Standard Bible. And the reason why is for apostles need to study, and they need to have a good study Bible. And prophets need to be able to link the themes and tie in word associations that the New American Standard makes better available than most sentence for sentence or dynamic equivalent translations.
What about the ESV when it comes to those word associations? How does it compare to NASB?
The NASB is more concordant, although the ESV is striven to be more concordant in more recent updates. The NASB beats the ESV as far as concordancy, word for word, hands down.
Well, describe to everyone what you mean by concordant. Not everybody understands your terms.
Sure. When I speak of a formal translation is one that allows the Greek and Hebrew grammatical forms to come through into English, and the NASB consistently renders those more so than other translations. When I speak of concordancy, I'm talking about vocabulary that is rendered with the same English word consistently throughout a translation. The English Standard Version doesn't do that as often or as frequently as the New American Standard Bible, because the English Standard Version is a little bit more concerned with the general context of the words that are rendered there. The NASB becomes a better tool for precision. I wouldn't say, I want to make a distinction between accuracy and precision. Precision means you're allowing consistency of translation. You're allowing a consistency of rendering the same word for word. For instance, let's say you get the word charis. The NASB would be more consistent in rendering that word as grace, where the ESV might recognize the context. Instead of consistently translating charis as grace, it would translate the Greek word charis as grace or gift or something along those lines, depending upon what the context demands. So in a sense, the ESV is a little bit more accurate, while the NASB would be more precise. So that's why the NASB I recommend for disciplined study, the ESV for as a tool ideal for use in the church for those who are already familiar with some theological language, some theological background, and the NIV, which it's another accurate translation, but not near as precise, which is ideal for a general audience. NLT, I would say the NLT also is an accurate translation, except it is not as precise because it is it's again very much dynamic, very much sentence by sentence. It's supposed to make sense to a general audience, and so that precision, that word for word precision, and that grammatical consistency, and that concordancy where words are translated word for word consistently across the board, the NLT doesn't have that.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Maybe one or two other questions. I was reading off of the chat, but I don't see any others. Anybody else?
Hey, Bishop Joe, this is Derek Ott.
Yes, Derek.
Hey, I apologize if someone's already asked this. I did have to step away from the call for about 10 minutes, but regarding the NLT, would that be recommended for children as well? Like I'm talking preteens?
The NLT could be recommended for children. I think that there's another translation that might be even more ideal. That would be the New International Reader's Version, which was specifically designed and targeted towards children. Its language is much more basic. It uses a smaller set of vocabulary than the NLT does. And for younger readers, the New International Reader's Version, what I think would be better than the New Living Translation. I think once you get into the teens, I think transition them on to the New Living Translation.
Okay, one more question or comment before we end it. Okay, so do me a favor, Matthew, just hold your book up again. We want to highly recommend this book.
It's called The Best Bible, ? So it's the best Bible, because that's the question that got asked all the time, by Matthew J. Barron. That's me. And this is available on Amazon. This is also available on my website, adventistpress.com. I can post those in the comments in just a moment.
Yeah. Well, you did a splendid job. Quite amazing, all the work you've put into. And I'm just excited over this book. It's a great tool. I've been a fan of reading on, all the translations for many, many years, and you put it all together better than anybody I've seen. And you updated it because other books I've read didn't include some of the latest translations like the ESV, Legacy Bible in 2020. So you've updated it, and it's just an amazing tool. Even if you're not going to read the whole book, I recommend you get the book for future reference when you have questions. Next week, we're going to have Leif Hetland again. This time, we're going to deal with the issue of Islam, long-term projections, friend or foe. We'll probably talk about what's going on in Afghanistan as well. And in 2 weeks, we're going to have Fred Market talking about the implications of what happened in Afghanistan from a geopolitical perspective and the prospect of speeding up World War III because of the collapse of the rise of the Taliban. So what are the implications for world peace in the next few years? So we're going to deal with that in 2 weeks. So next week we're going to continue this amazing dialogue. Vince, can you transition us to a close now?
I mean, I don't know how to follow today up. This was absolutely outstanding. Again, this teaching will be available if you're watching on YouTube. We have a playlist that's available for you if you're watching on Facebook. Save this link, as well as for those who are on Zoom, you can go to uscal.us, and as soon as the conclusion of this meeting occurs, this video will be available. I've already sent it out to my church. I encourage you all to do the same for your networks and those you have influence over. So we thank you so much for being here today and look forward to seeing you next time.
And maybe what we could do is put the link for Matthew's book on our USCAL website too. Highly recommend the book. So try to connect with Matthew. Well, really appreciate all of you. Thanks for being a part of this every week. It's profound. We have incredible discussions, and highlight of my week is being with all of you. So let's just take a minute to say goodbye. This has been sponsored by USCAL. You can go to uscal.us for the past global tables. If you want to join USCAL, I would highly encourage you. If you lead a movement or a network in the workplace or church place, join this community. Certain things that we do will be invitation only, like that roundtable. So let's all say goodbye to each other. Take a few minutes now. Good to see all of you. Good to see Apostle Ron.
God bless you all.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thanks for the
Thank you,
great
Matthew.
teaching again.
Appreciate it.
Stanley, Colvin, Carol,
God bless everybody.
Dennis.
Bless